Jihoon's office opens without knocking. He doesn't look up from the reports spread out on the ebony desk. His fingers, with their slender yet strong phalanges, turn the pages. He knows that only one person can enter without a report. Min-seok stops on the other side of the table. His posture betrays tension. His shoulders are raised, his hands are clenched into fists and tucked into the pockets of his worn coat. He breathes deeper than usual. "Jihoon," he begins, his voice hoarse. Jihoon finally lifts his head. His warmthless gaze glides over his twin. He sees a shadow of his own appearance, distorted by uncertainty and poorly concealed need. The same slant of his eyes, the same line of his jaw, but there's not a shred of his own firmness in his expression. "Speak," Jihoon says, his tone flat, indifferent. "I need money," Min-seok blurts out, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Just a small amount. I'll pay it back. It's just, things are tough right now." Jihoon leans back in his chair. He folds his hands in front of him. "What difficulties? Wrong people again? Wrong choices again?" Min-seok presses his lips together silently, his jaw tense. "You asked for money 5 years ago," Jihoon continues, his voice growing quieter, but only more dangerous. "I gave it to you. You said it was for business. And then you disappeared and left me with your debts, your problems. I know, I was wrong. A mistake?" Jihoon grins, but there's no humor in his eyes. "It's not a mistake. It's a betrayal. You betrayed me. And now you come back again, thinking time has erased everything? No." Min-seok looks up at him, a desperate plea flashing in his eyes. "Jihoon, I'm your brother." "Brother?" Jihoon says the word like a death sentence. "That's why you're still standing here. That's why your legs aren't broken. But you won't get any money, not a cent. Understand?" Min-seok freezes. Humiliation and anger wore on his face. He slowly straightens up, his fists unclenching in his pockets. He nods, briefly and sharply. "Yes, got it." He turns and walks toward the exit. His steps are loud, nervous. His hand grips the door handle. Before leaving, he turns around. His gaze darkens. "You'll regret it," he whispers so quietly that the words barely reach Jihoon. Jihoon watches him go. He hears the threat. But to him, it's just empty words, a pathetic attempt to save face. He brushes it away as if it were an annoying fly and returns to studying the reports. For him, the incident is over. A few hours later, Jihoon calls his driver. He gives brief instructions to Emily, his maid. "I'm leaving for 2 days. Don't let anyone in. Clean up the library." Emily just nods silently, standing at the threshold of the living room. She's a shadow in this spacious penthouse with its panoramic windows. Her movements are smooth, practiced to the point of automatism. She doesn't ask unnecessary questions. Jihoon leaves. The silence in the penthouse becomes thick, almost tangible. Emily follows familiar routes. Dust is wiped, surfaces are polished to a shine. Every object finds its perfect place. She lives in a world of clean lines and impeccable cleanliness that Jihoon has created. Her world is confined within these walls. The day passes. That evening, as Emily dusts the display case in the hallway, she hears the click of the electronic lock. The door opens. She freezes. Jihoon enters. He takes off his coat and hangs it on the counter. Emily involuntarily takes a step forward, her eyes widening. "Master, you left until the day after tomorrow." He turns to face her, an unfamiliar, slight smile on his face. "Business canceled. Everything's fine, Emily." It's Min-seok. He studied his brother's movements and posture down to the last detail, but his gaze lacks Jihoon's usual icy reserve. Instead, there's a warmth that baffles Emily. I'll cook you dinner," she says quickly, trying to hide her confusion. "Take your time." His voice softens. "How are you? How was your day?" The question hangs in the air. Emily freezes, rag in hand. In all his years of work, he's never once asked her how her day was. She looks at him, trying to find the catch, but sees only the same smile. Everything is fine, Master. Thank you." "Great," he says, walking past her into the living room. "And Emily? Your coffee? It was always the best." She's speechless. She just stands there, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Her insides twist. The next morning, Minseok comes down for breakfast. He's wearing one of Jihoon's expensive robes, feeling increasingly comfortable in his skin. Emily serves him coffee. Her movements are careful. She barely looks at him. "I have something for you," he says, taking a small box out of his pocket. She hesitantly takes it. Inside are expensive cleaning gloves made of thin but durable leather. "To keep your hands warm," Minseok explains, watching her reaction. "When you wash the floor in the winter." Emily looks at the gloves. They're beautiful and practical, something she'd never even considered. Something warm and strange stirs in her chest. A squeeze, then a flutter. "Thank you." Her voice was almost a whisper. "That's very kind of you." "It's nothing," he says, taking a sip of coffee, hiding a smile. He sees his game is working. Her armor of silent devotion is showing its first crack. That evening, he finds her in the library. She's sitting in a chair, a book on her lap. Her eyes are closed, her breathing even. She's fallen asleep over the pages. Minseok approaches silently. He looks at her for a few moments. Then he says softly, "Emily." She wakes up with a start. Seeing him, she jumps up instantly, the book clattering to the floor. "Sorry, I just—" "Hush!" He raises his hand, calming her. "It's okay. Go to sleep. You're driving yourself crazy." Emily stares at him, disbelieving. Care? From him? That was unheard of. Her job was to work. His was to demand perfection. There were no other rules. I'll finish it." She tries to object, but her voice trembles. "You'll finish it tomorrow." His tone brooks no objection, but it lacks the usual harshness. "Now is rest." He takes a step forward. They stand very close. She freezes, unable to move. He slowly reaches out and straightens a strand of her hair that has come loose from her neat hairstyle. His fingers lightly touch her temple. Emily stops breathing. She feels the warmth of his skin, the faint scent of his cologne. The same as always, but now it feels different. Her heart beats somewhere in her throat. His gaze drops to her lips. He lingers there for a long, drawn-out second. She sees something in his eyes she's never seen before. Interest, attention. He leans a little closer, and she instinctively closes her eyes. But there should be no kiss. When she opens her eyes again, he's already retreating. A faint, almost invisible smile touches his lips. "Good night, Emily," he says, and walks out of the library. The door closes. She's left standing in the middle of the room, alone. Everything inside her collapses. Emptiness and a strange, aching disappointment fill her. The air feels thick, and it's hard to breathe. She raises her hand and touches her temple, where his fingers had just been. The world she knew has been turned upside down in 2 days. The real Jihoon returned unexpectedly. The door swung open, slamming against the wall. He stepped inside, and it was immediately clear he was in a terrible mood. He looked exhausted. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed with fatigue. He shrugged his long black coat off his shoulders, and it fell in a heavy heap onto the marble floor of the hallway. He didn't even glance at it, simply walked on, leaving a wet footprint behind. Emily was just watering the flowers in the living room. Hearing a noise, she turned around. And instead of her usual caution, a wave of joy suddenly swept over her. Before her stood the very man who had been so kind to her for 2 days. The one who saw her as more than just a servant. The one whose attention made her heart clench. Without thinking, she ran toward him. Her movements were light, quick, and filled with genuine emotion. She snatched his coat from the floor and on impulse rose on tiptoe and quickly, timidly, kissed him on the cheek. "I'm so glad you're back," she breathed, stepping back and beaming. It all happened in a second, but that second was enough for everything to change. Jihoon froze. He didn't move, as if he'd turned into a statue. She felt his entire body tense, hard as stone. He slowly turned his head toward her, and his gaze, there wasn't a drop of warmth in his eyes. There was only shock, anger, and utter incomprehension. His face contorted. "Are you completely crazy?" His voice was quiet, but so terrifying that it sent shivers down her spine. He didn't scream. He hissed. He thrust his hand forward and roughly pushed her away. He didn't mean to hurt her, but his push was so powerful that she flew back, barely able to keep her balance. "What was that?" It sounded like thunder. His voice boomed throughout the spacious living room. Emily jumped back, as if she'd been scalded with boiling water. The cheek she'd just kissed burned with shame. But inside, it was even worse. Her small, happy world, built for 2 days, was crumbling to dust right before her eyes. And tears began to stream down her face. Hot, copious, they rolled down her cheeks, and she couldn't do anything about it. "Why?" Her voice trembled and broke. "Why are you like this now? These 2 days?" "These 2 days were different." She looked at him through tears, trying to find in his features the gentle man who had given her gloves and cared for her. But before her stood a stranger, cold and cruel. Ji-hoon saw her tears. He saw her trembling. He saw the genuine, unadulterated confusion in her eyes. And his anger began to give way to a cold, clear understanding. Something was wrong. Something very serious. Her reaction didn't feel like a brazen prank. It was the reaction of someone who's been deceived. "What 2 days?" he asked. His voice was quiet again, but now there was a steely danger in the silence. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively pressed herself against the wall. "Speak," he ordered curtly. And sobbing and faltering, she began to tell her story. She talked about his unexpected return, about his smile, about how he asked how she was doing, about how he complimented her coffee, then about the gift, warm gloves so her hands wouldn't freeze. She told how he found her sleeping in the library and told her to go and rest. And finally, the most intimate and most painful thing, how he came close, touched her hair, looked at her lips, and how she waited for a kiss that never came. He was so close, and he was looking me, and I thought. She couldn't speak anymore. She just stood there with her head down, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Ji-hoon listened, without moving. His face gradually grew more stony, impassive, but his eyes burned with an icy fire. They boiled with rage, so intense that it seemed the air around him crackled with tension. He looked past it, seeing a completely different picture. "Min Seok," he said, just one name, and that name contained everything: contempt, anger, and an understanding of the utter baseness of what had happened. He slowly, his chilling gaze never leaving hers, pulled out his phone. His fingers quickly dialed a number. Emily, under his gaze, cowered, trying to become less noticeable, wishing she could disappear into thin air. "He's at the Golden Dragon," he said into the phone in a flat, metallic voice. "Bragging! Bring him! Now!" He pocketed the phone. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. Emily held her breath, realizing she had become a bargaining chip in some terrible game between the brothers. Less than an hour passed. 2 burly men in suits wordlessly ushered Min Seok into the office. He walked slightly unsteadily, his clothes rumpled, his hair disheveled. He smelled of alcohol, but when he saw Ji-hoon and a tearful Emily in the corner, he grinned cheekily. Ji-hoon rose from the table and walked closer to his brother. The difference between them was now obvious to everyone. Ji-hoon was collected, cold, and dangerous. Min Seok was a pathetic parody. "Have you stooped so low as to use a maid?" Ji-hoon asked quietly. Every word was spot on. "Is this your plan? To annoy me through the cleaning lady?" Min Seok snorted, then burst into laughter. He laughed loudly and hysterically, looking straight into his brother's face. "Did it work?" he cried, still laughing. "Tell me, did it work? Did she believe it?" He nodded at Emily. "She accepted me as you, as the best version of you, as someone who could be kind, who could see people like her as human beings. I was what you could never be." His words hung in the air, venomous and stinging. Ji-hoon didn't move. He just looked at his brother with such icy contempt that even Min Seok gradually fell silent, his laughter dying down. Ji-hoon nodded silently to his men. They grabbed Min Seok's arms tightly and, without a word, led him out of the office. The door closed. Emily was still standing in the corner. She stared at the floor, tears dripping onto her simple clothes. She felt utterly humiliated, insulted, and used. She wished for only one thing, for the earth to open up and swallow her. She was just a tool in their struggle, a foolish doll who believed in a fairy tale. When the noise outside the door died down, Ji-hoon slowly turned to face her. He walked closer, his steps quiet. He stopped 2 steps away from her. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was unusually quiet, lacking its usual steel. "For dragging you into this." Emily nodded silently, still not looking up at him. She had nothing to say. The words were stuck in her throat. She just wanted to disappear. The silence in the office after Min-seok left was thick and heavy, like lead. Emily stood leaning against the wall, staring at the pattern on the Persian rug, trying to blend into the wallpaper, to disappear. Every inch of her body burned with shame. She felt fooled, used, and incredibly stupid. How could she have believed it? How could she have fallen for such a cheap lie? Ji-hoon remained motionless, watching her. The anger that had been seething within him a moment ago had subsided, replaced by a complex, unfamiliar range of emotions. He saw her trying to suppress a tremor, her fingers unconsciously fiddling with the hem of her apron. She wasn't a pawn, she was a victim. A victim of his brother and, in a sense, of his own coldness. He broke the silence, his voice unusually quiet, almost thinking out loud, breaking the oppressive stillness of the room. "This kiss." Emily flinched, as if struck by a sudden electric shock. She instinctively pressed herself further against the wall, expecting another burst of anger. Her heart sank. She braced herself for anything, sneer, contempt, an order to pack her things. Was it for him? Or for me? The question hung in the air, unexpected and poignant. It didn't sound like an accusation. There was a strange, genuine curiosity in it, even a hint of something she couldn't place. Slowly, overcoming the resistance of every muscle, she raised her eyes to him. Her gaze was blurred by tears, but she saw him clearly. He didn't look down on her. He looked straight into her, his dark eyes serious, without a trace of the usual iciness. She searched for words, her mind racing. What did he want to hear? The truth? But what did it matter now? It was all a lie. And yet his question demanded an answer, an honest answer. He? Her voice was hoarse with tears, a whisper barely audible. She swallowed the lump in her throat and exhaled. He was for you. Ji-hoon didn't move. His face remained impassive, but something twitched deep in his eyes. To whom? She continued, plucking up her courage. You have been these 2 days. She couldn't say more. The words drained her. She lowered her head again, expecting him to laugh, to call her a fool, to remind her that this man was a fake. But instead, he nodded slowly, very slowly. It wasn't a nod of agreement or approval. It was a nod of understanding. He understood. He understood the essence. He took a step forward, then another. Now he stood so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, catch the faint, familiar scent of his cologne mingled with the scent of rain in the city at night. She saw every feature of his face, every wrinkle around his eyes. And his face no longer wore the distorting mask of anger. It was calm, serious, and truly attentive. I liked it, he said quietly, so quietly that the words seemed to brush against her skin rather than reach her ears. Emily froze. For a second, her brain refused to process the meaning. She looked up at him again, in comprehension and confusion. She thought she'd misheard. Perhaps it was mockery, some kind of sophisticated, cruel joke. What? Was the only thing she could manage to squeeze out. Her voice sounded stupid and helpless. The corners of his lips twitched in a barely perceptible, almost invisible smile. Not mocking, but genuine. The way you greeted me, he repeated, his voice gaining a little firmness. That kiss. I liked it. There was no pathos in those words, none of the romanticism his brother had played at. It was a statement of fact, as honest as a blow. And the honesty took her breath away. He didn't say it was appropriate. He didn't say it was right. He simply said he liked it. And in that moment, he ceased to be her superior, the cold boss, the being from another dimension. He became simply a man standing before a woman and telling her something important. He slowly raised his hand. Emily instinctively closed her eyes, expecting a rough touch, a push away. But his fingers brushed her cheek with such unexpected tenderness that she shuddered. It wasn't like Minciox's. He touched her like an actor feigning tenderness, his movements light, almost airy, false. Jihoon's touch was different. It was firm, confident, weighty. His fingers, strong and warm, lay on her skin, erasing the traces of tears. It was real, so real that tears welled up again, but this time from a strange, aching relief. He looked at her, his gaze heavy and direct. "I won't give you gloves or say pretty words," he said, and each word fell on her with the clarity of a mountain air. "I'm not him. I won't pretend, but I can be honest." His hand slid from her cheek to her chin, gently lifting it so she could look into his eyes. "And now I am honest." He leaned over. Their first real kiss wasn't rushed or passionate. It was slow, incredibly slow, giving her time to absorb every moment. He didn't seize her, didn't demand. He offered. His lips touched hers lightly at first, almost silently, as if testing whether she would pull away. She felt their warmth, the slight roughness, the taste of coffee, and something elusive that was uniquely his. Emily didn't pull away. She froze, immersing herself in this sensation. All the shock, all the pain, all the humiliation of the last few minutes began to melt, dissolve in this simple, silent contact. It wasn't a kiss of gratitude, not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of understanding, of recognition. It held a quiet rage at his brother, embarrassment at his naivety, and a strange, timid promise of something new. He didn't press her, didn't try to deepen the kiss, he simply waited. And when her lips, almost without her consent, responded to his touch with a light, barely noticeable movement, he allowed the kiss to become a little more confident, a little firmer. His hand moved from her chin to her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of ownership, but not a harsh one. It was an acknowledgement. He pulled away as slowly as he had begun. Their breathing mingled, uneven. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own confusion, but also a shadow of the same calm that had appeared on his face earlier. They didn't say a word. Words would have been unnecessary. They would have ruined everything. They simply stood facing each other in the quiet, empty office, and the air between them was no longer heavy with anger and shame. It was filled with a quiet, trembling anticipation, an anticipation of what would happen next. The next morning arrived with inexorable regularity. Sunlight, cold and clear, cut through the living room, illuminating the tiny particles of dust Emily had meticulously wiped away the previous day. Everything was in its place. Perfectly polished surfaces, impeccably arranged objects, an oppressive silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Emily woke in her small servants' quarters with a strange sense of duality. Last night had seemed like a dream, vivid, painful, and yet beautiful. And now reality had arrived, the one in which she was merely a servant, and he the master of this cold kingdom of glass and steel. She put on her simple, dark workrobe, smoothed her hair, and taking a deep breath, walked into the kitchen to begin the day. Her movements were automatic, honed by years of habit. She made coffee exactly how he liked it, black, without sugar, in that same heavy porcelain cup he preferred. Her heart was pounding as she entered the dining room. He was already seated at the table, pushed back against the huge window. A stack of papers and a clipboard lay before him, engrossed in yet another report. Everything as usual, nothing betrayed yesterday's events, not a single feature of his impassive face. She placed her coffee cup to his right, on the small napkin, as was proper. Her hand shook, and the coffee nearly spilled over the rim. She froze, waiting for him to look up at her, to say something. He did neither. He simply reached out, took the cup without looking, and took a small sip. Disappointment, bitter and heavy, filled her. So that's it? Everything was going back to normal? Was yesterday just a momentary weakness, a strange reaction to stress? She was about to turn away, feeling a lump rising in her throat. And at that moment, he looked up. Not on the cup, not on the documents, but on her. Their gazes met. Just for a second, less than a second. But in that lightning-fast flash of contact, there was neither boss nor maid. There was none of yesterday's rage or tenderness. There was something else, awareness, a deep, mutual, and as yet unspoken understanding that something had irrevocably shifted between them. The air in the room didn't warm up, but it acquired a new quality, elastic, dense, as if the space between them was filled with invisible energy. She quickly lowered her eyes and left the dining room, feeling heat spread across her cheeks. He, after a brief glance, returned to his papers, but his fingers paused for a second, clutching the pen. Before he began making notes in the margins again, the day continued in the same rhythm. She did her work. He did his. They exchanged no unnecessary words, not a hint of yesterday's intimacy. And yet, that intimacy hung in the air, like electricity before a thunderstorm. When she entered his office to dust, he sat with his head glued to his computer screen, but she caught his gaze before he just as quickly looked away. When he passed her in the hallway, he didn't slow down, but the space around him seemed to shrink, and she physically felt his approach and retreat. Everything remained the same, but nothing was the same. After lunch, Emily began mopping the hallway floors as usual. She filled a basin with warm water, added lemon-scented cleaner, and, kneeling, began scrubbing the marble slabs with a stiff brush with her usual dexterity. This was her routine, monotonous, meditative work. She immersed herself in it, trying not to think about anything else. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. She recognized their gait, firm, measured. She kept her head down, trying to appear completely absorbed in her task. The footsteps came closer and stopped a few meters away. She felt his gaze on her back. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned around and raised her head. Jihoon stood with his hands in his trouser pockets and looked at her, not at the cleanliness of the floor, but at her posture, her knees resting on the hard, cold stone, her bent back. He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I like you." He didn't utter any of those beautiful, resounding words that could describe the storm raging between them. He simply looked at the cabinet in the corner, where the inventory was kept, and his voice, flat and emotionless, broke the silence. "Don't kneel. Pick up a mop." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked into his office, leaving the door ajar. Emily remained sitting on the floor. His words echoed within her. "Don't kneel." It wasn't a request, not a suggestion. It was an order. But this order didn't have the usual dryness. It contained concern. Not the ostentatious, sweet concern that Min Se-ok bestowed with gloves, but real, practical, stern concern. A concern that didn't humiliate, but uplifted. That saw not just a function, but a person who might be in pain, uncomfortable, or distressed. For her, at that moment, these simple, everyday words meant more than any confession imaginable. They meant more than all the beautiful words in the world, because they were honest. They came from the very man he truly was, not the ghost of those 2 days, but the real Jihoon. And this man, cold, harsh, and taciturn, saw her, and cared for her. The way he knew how. She rose slowly from her knees. She went to the cabinet and pulled out a long, modern mop with a microfiber pad. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. She began mopping the floor again. Her movements were just as precise. But inside, everything was different. Their story didn't end with a confession. It didn't end with a passionate kiss. It was only just beginning. Right now, with this quiet morning, with this silent look, with this simple, everyday concern, and in this quiet, complex simplicity, there was more truth and more promise than in any beautiful fairy tale. Several days passed. An unspoken tension still hung in the air, but now it was less anxious and more patient and expectant. Emily carried out her duties, and Jihoon went about his business. Their occasional glances spoke volumes, but their words remained. One evening, late at night, Emily found herself alone in her room. The next day was her little sister's birthday, and she'd finally found time to try on the dress she'd ordered online a few weeks ago. It was simple yet elegant. Navy blue, form-fitting, off the shoulder, a far cry from her gray work smocks. She put it on and carefully twirled in front of the small mirror, trying to get a good look at herself. The dress fit perfectly, accentuating her figure. For a moment, she forgot where she was, imagining herself at a party, surrounded by laughter and music, An ordinary girl in a beautiful outfit, she needed to see herself full length. The largest mirror at her disposal hung in the walk-in closet adjacent to Jihoon's bedroom. Knowing he wasn't home, he was late for a meeting. She lifted her hem and tiptoed out of her room, passing through his bedroom and into the walk-in closet. Her reflection in the huge mirror pleased her. She smiled at herself and straightened a strand of her hair. In that moment, she wasn't a maid, she was simply Emily. Just then, footsteps sounded outside the door. Quick, confident. Her heart sank. The bedroom door opened, and Jihoon appeared on the threshold. The meeting had apparently ended earlier than he had planned. He froze when he saw her. His gaze, accustomed to registering details and threats, slid over her, and an expression of profound astonishment appeared on his usually impassive face. He wasn't looking at a maid caught off guard. He was looking at a woman, a beautiful, slender woman in an elegant blue dress, standing in his dressing room, bathed in soft light, her posture betraying both confusion and a sudden surge of pride. Emily froze like a deer in headlights. Her arms fell limply at her sides. I'm sorry, she whispered, her face burning. I was trying it on for my sister's birthday. I didn't think you... He didn't interrupt her. He simply continued to look. His gaze was heavy, searching, but there was no longer a hint of judgment in it. He was interested, deeply interested. He saw the difference, and the difference astonished him. "Don't apologize," he finally said. His voice was low, a little hoarse. He took a few steps into the dressing room, and the space around him immediately became smaller. He stopped 2 steps away from her, his eyes still fixed on her image. "Blue suits you," he said simply. It wasn't a compliment in the traditional sense. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same honesty as everything he said. Emily swallowed, unable to speak. She saw his expression change. The last wall, the last barrier separating the boss from the man, was gone. Here was simply a man looking at a woman and liking her. "Are you free the day after tomorrow evening?" he asked unexpectedly. The question hung in the air, deafening her more than any scream. She could only nod, confused. "Okay." He nodded slowly in response, his gaze finally moving away from her dress and meeting hers. "Then I'll pick you up. We'll have dinner." He didn't ask, "Do you want it?" He didn't offer, he stated something, but there was no command in his tone. There was confidence. Confidence that she would agree. And that he wanted it. Jihoon had just arranged a date with... Their story, quiet and cautious, took a new, decisive step forward. Jihoon, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit without a tie, was waiting for her in the hall. When Emily emerged from her room, he paused for a second. She was wearing the same blue dress, and his gaze flashed the same frank interest he'd seen in the dressing room. They drove to the restaurant in silence. But this silence was different. Not awkward, but tense, filled with anticipation. The restaurant was quiet, with subdued lighting and tables secluded in separate alcoves. Everything was impeccable. He ordered dinner and consulted the sommelier about wine. He did everything as he was supposed to. But his attention was completely focused on her. He listened to her stories about her sister, about her childhood, and asked questions. And all the while, his gaze kept drifting to her lips. For the first time in a long time, she saw him less than completely confident. There was a discreet tension in his movements, in the way he held the glass to her. He wanted to kiss her, that was obvious, and for the first time in her life, she had power over him. And she decided to use this power. When he leaned across the table to straighten his napkin, inadvertently bringing his face close to hers, she gently but firmly leaned back against the chair and continued her story about how her sister had been afraid of thunderstorms as a child. A hint of annoyance flickered in his eyes. Later, when they stepped out onto a small terrace overlooking the city at night, he stood close, too close. His hand rested on the railing, almost touching hers. She felt the warmth radiating from him, his desire to close the distance, to touch, to lean in, and finally, to repeat that kiss. But instead of giving in, she stepped aside, leaned on the railing with her other hand, and, looking out at the city lights, said, "What a beautiful view. Do you come here often?" He didn't answer. She felt his gaze on her profile. He was confused. He, Jihoon, who was used to having all his desires fulfilled on demand, couldn't get a simple kiss from his own maid. And it bothered him, and it turned him on even more. On the way home, in the darkened car, he tried again. His hand rested on the seat between them, his little finger almost touching her thigh. She carefully placed her purse on her lap, creating a barrier, and continued to look out the window, commenting on how the neighborhood had changed at night. When they pulled up to the house and he got out and offered her his arm, she smiled politely, said, "Thank you, I won't fall," and got out of the car on her own, heading toward the elevator. He walked silently beside her. She sensed his disappointment and growing desire. She liked this feeling. She liked being someone who couldn't be won with a simple order or a slight gesture. She liked being someone who had to be won, someone whose consent had a price. This evening, she was not beneath him. She hovered somewhere high, pulling the strings, and he, the powerful Jihoon, followed those strings, trying to anticipate her next move. At the penthouse door, he stopped and turned to face her. "Thank you for the evening," she said first, her voice even and friendly, but without a hint of submissiveness. She extended her hand for a formal handshake. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her face. An internal struggle raged in his eyes between his habit of commanding and a new, unfamiliar desire to achieve. He didn't take her hand. Instead, he stepped forward, entering her personal space without touching her. "I want to kiss you," he breathed. It wasn't a request. It was an admission of defeat in this little game. Emily looked up at him, a small, barely perceptible smile playing on her lips. "I know," she replied softly. And turning, she opened the door and walked inside, leaving him alone in the hallway. She didn't say no. She didn't say yes. She simply stated a fact, and in this uncertainty lay her strength. Their story continued, and she now dictated the rules. The elevator slowly ascended to the top floor, and Emily, standing alone in its mirrored cabin, finally allowed herself to exhale. The tension of the evening, which she had so carefully controlled, now washed over her like a wave, causing her knees to tremble slightly. She touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the burning, thwarted kiss on them, the heat of his gaze. A strange mixture of triumph and nervous desire raged in her chest. She had done it. She had resisted. And he remained there, outside the door, crushed by her silent refusal. Upon entering the penthouse, the first thing she did was remove her high heels, feeling the cool, polished marble beneath her bare feet. She was almost certain he wouldn't follow her. His pride wouldn't allow him to pursue her after such a clear signal. But as she headed toward her room, his voice drifted from the living room, low and even, without a hint of reproach. "Coffee!" It wasn't a proposal, not a request. It was a test, an order, but delivered with a new, subtle tone. He was testing to see if things would return to normal, or if the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Emily froze for a second, then slowly turned and walked into the kitchen. Her movements were as precise as always, measured spoons of ground beans, the exact temperature of the water. But now every action was imbued with new meaning. She wasn't just doing her job, she was playing a role, and he was her audience. She entered the living room with a tray and placed a cup of steaming black coffee on the low table in front of him. He sat in his leather chair, not looking at the documents, but staring out the window into the darkness. His jacket was off, his tie loosened. He looked not angry, but deeply thoughtful. "Sit down," he said, still looking out the window. She slowly sank onto the edge of the sofa opposite, keeping her distance. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, as befits a servant, but her gaze was calm and composed. She didn't lower her eyes. He finally turned his gaze to her. He studied her posture, her defiant calm. "Was the evening a failure?" he asked. The question was a trap. If she said no, it would be interpreted as encouragement. If she said yes, it would be an insult. "The evening was very interesting," she replied neutrally, meeting his gaze. The corner of his mouth twitched. He lifted his cup, took a sip, and his eyes narrowed, either at the bitterness of the coffee or at her answer. "You seemed distant," he remarked, setting his cup down on its saucer with a soft clang. I was being myself, she retorted softly. You invited me to dinner. I shared dinner with you. I'm grateful for the evening. He snorted, a short, humorless sound. Don't play dumb, Emily. You know what I mean. She allowed herself a small, barely noticeable smile. I know, but I'm not sure you know. His eyebrows rose. He was clearly amused by her impudence. Did she anger him? Perhaps. But most of all, she intrigued him. I wanted to kiss you. He repeated his words from the hallway, now in the silence of the living room, where they sounded even more frank. And I said I knew, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. But knowledge is not consent. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. She, the girl who washed his floors, was now dictating the terms in his own living room. And the most shocking thing was, he liked it. It challenged him. It ignited a passion he'd long since lost. What do you want? He asked bluntly. It wasn't the kind of question one asks a maid. It was the kind a man asks a woman, who keeps him guessing. Emily thought for a moment, looking at his strong hands, clasped together, the concentrated expression on his face. She loved the feeling of power, this dizzying reversal of roles. He had to achieve. He had to try. I want you to understand that I'm not a thing to be taken at will, she said finally. Not a trophy. You asked me out. You saw me in a dress, not an apron. The rules are different now. And what are these rules? There was a hint of mockery in his voice, but behind it there was genuine curiosity. I haven't decided yet, she admitted honestly, a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. When I decide, I'll let you know. He laughed, briefly, quietly, but it was real. The sound was so unexpected that Emily almost jumped out of her seat. Okay, he said, and something new appeared in his gaze. Respect. We have a deal. He stood up, and his shadow fell over her. He walked over to the sofa and sat down next to her, not touching, but close. Too close. He turned to face her, leaning his elbow on the back of the sofa. But it's a two-player game, Emily, he whispered, his voice low and intimate. You make the rules, but I still make the moves. His face was so close she could feel his warm breath on her skin. His gaze fell on her lips again, insistent, hungry. Instinct told her to pull away, to maintain control. But another, deeper instinct told her to stay, to sense the danger, to taste the forbidden fruit. She didn't pull away. She simply looked into his eyes, her own breathing quickening. She let him look. She let him want. That, too, was part of her power, the ability to withstand his desire without giving in to it. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he reached out and ran the back of his fingers across her cheek. It was a fleeting, almost weightless touch, but it sent shivers down her spine. She didn't flinch. You're playing with fire, he said quietly, his fingers brushing the line of her jaw. Perhaps, her voice wavered, but she forced herself to speak evenly. But it's my fire, and I decide who gets burned with it. His eyes flashed at these words. They held admiration, desire, and a hint of irritation. He leaned in another centimeter, closing the distance to a minimum. Their lips almost touched. She felt a magnetic pull, an animalistic urge to close her eyes and give in. But she didn't do it. Instead, she gently but firmly placed her palm on his chest, stopping him. Her hand rested on the hard muscle beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. She could feel the rapid, powerful beating of his heart. It was beating at the same frantic pace as hers. Not today, she whispered, looking straight into his eyes, full of agonizing pain. Rule number 1, not today. He froze, his body tensing with frustration. He could ignore her, he could insist on his own way. He had the strength, but that would be a return to the old rules, the rules of master and maid. And he, as she had hoped, was already playing a different game. He retreated slowly, with visible effort, his breathing heavy. Okay, he breathed, his voice hoarse. Nah, not today. He rose from the sofa, and she suddenly felt cold without his presence. He walked to his office without looking back and closed the door behind him. But he didn't slam it. She remained sitting on the sofa, alone, in the quiet living room, Listening to the frantic pounding of her own heart, she had won this round. She had forced him to back down. She had forced him to accept her terms. And in that sweet, dizzying feeling of victory, there was more than just pride. There was anticipation. Anticipation of the next move in this dangerous, thrilling game, where the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. Their story continued, and now she danced on the edge of a knife, balancing her newfound power with the all-consuming desire he awakened in her. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. Emily sat on the couch, still feeling the sting of his touch on her cheek and the powerful, rapid rhythm of his heart in her palm. The air in the living room seemed thick, saturated with unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. She had won. She had forced him to back down, to accept her rules. But this victory felt less like a triumph than the beginning of something greater, more dangerous, and more exciting. Now she knew. His interest hadn't faded with rejection. It had only grown stronger, fueled by the challenge. The following days became an intricate, silent dance. Ji-hoon didn't return to the conversation about that evening directly, but their daily interactions took on a new, complex meaning. He still gave orders, but now his voice, when he addressed her, no longer held the usual cold detachment, but a wary attentiveness. He was watching, and she felt his gaze on her, when she set the table, when she watered the flowers, when she simply walked down the hallway. One morning, when she was serving him breakfast, he asked without looking at the plate, "What's your favorite dish?" The question caught her off guard. In all their years of work, he'd never once asked her about her preferences. "Pasta with truffle sauce," she answered after a moment's pause, trying to keep her voice steady. He simply nodded, made a note on his tablet, and continued reading the news. But the next evening, when she went into the kitchen to make herself dinner, a cardboard box from a famous Italian restaurant was waiting for her on the table. Inside was pasta with truffle sauce, still warm. No note, no explanation. Just the fact, his move. He didn't give her gloves, like Min Seok would have. He let her know that he heard her, and that he could give her what she wanted without saying a word. It was a move worthy of him, direct, practical, and incredibly effective. Emily ate her pasta standing at the table, each bite sweeter with the knowledge that he, Ji-hoon, had taken the time and effort to anticipate her wishes. But she didn't go and thank him. She simply washed the dishes and put the box away. Her silence was her response. A wordless confession. Music became another battleground. Ji-hoon always preferred complete silence or laconic, abstract jazz compositions. One day, while cleaning his office and he was on call, Emily quietly hummed a melody to herself, an old French ballad her mother loved. He hung up and turned to her. "What is it?" he asked. She looked embarrassed. "It's just a song." "Sorry, I won't disturb you." "Sing some more," he ordered, but there was no command in his voice. There was curiosity. She shook her head. "No, it's personal." The next day, returning from a business meeting, he walked into the living room and turned on the sound system. The silence was broken by the gentle, melancholy chords of a guitar and a low, velvety voice singing that very same French ballad. He stood with his back to her, looking out the window, but she saw his reflection in the glass. He was looking at her. He'd found that song. He'd spent time finding the one, the only song she'd ever hummed. And now he was sharing it with her, wordlessly. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. It was more intimate than any kiss. He was invading her memories, her soul, with terrifying precision. She couldn't resist and left the room. But that evening, passing by the living room, she found him sitting in the dark, the same song playing again. He wasn't just playing it for her, he liked it too. Another bridge between their two worlds. Emily, however, held her ground. Her strategy was controlled intimacy. She allowed herself to smile at him when he did something like this, a rare, reserved smile that she saw make his eyes sparkle. Occasionally, she herself would break the distance, accidentally touching his arm while handing him a cup of coffee, or standing a little closer than necessary while they looked at a document together. She teased him with tiny doses of intimacy, enough to keep his interest simmering, but never crossing the line where she would lose control. He responded with growing impatience. His glances became longer and more revealing. He began finding excuses to be near her more often. He'd suddenly need help setting up a new projector in his office, or he'd ask her opinion on wine for an upcoming dinner with business partners, something completely out of character for him. One day, while she was dusting the bookshelves in the library, he walked in and stood so close that his chest almost touched her back. She froze, feeling his warmth through the thin fabric of her dress. "You smell different," he said quietly, his lips close to her ear. "Not perfume. Something different. With soap," she answered without turning around, her voice hoarse. "Regular soap." "It suits you," he inhaled as if taking in her scent. It was so intimate that her legs buckled. He wasn't touching her, but the sensation was almost tangible. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone, her heart pounding. She knew the game was going too far. The tension had reached boiling point. He, like a tiger, was preparing to pounce, and her wiles and prohibitions only whetted his appetite. She felt herself losing ground, her own body and mind beginning to betray her. She loved this attention. She loved the power, but she loved him even more. His focus, his unexpected sensitivity, the raw, unbridled strength that emanated from him. The decisive battle took place a week after their date. It was late evening. The penthouse was silent. Emily, having finished her chores, decided to take a bath. She knew Ji-hoon was in his office, absorbed in his work. She locked the bathroom door, turned on the water, and added a few drops of lavender oil she'd bought for herself, a small luxury she allowed herself. She sank into the hot water, closed her eyes, and tried to relax, but her thoughts were filled with him, his image, his voice, his touches that weren't there, but that she could clearly imagine. She spent almost an hour in the water until it began to cool. Wrapped in a large, soft towel, she left the bathroom and walked down the hallway to her room. She was relaxed, her skin steamy, her hair damp and loose. She heard no sounds and assumed he was still in the office. But when she went into the living room to turn off the light, she saw him. He was standing at the bar, pouring himself a whiskey. He was wearing no jacket, his shirt unbuttoned to the top 2 buttons. He heard her footsteps and turned around. His gaze fell on her, and such an intense, undisguised hunger blazed in his eyes that she felt a chill run down her spine. She froze in place, instinctively pulling the towel to her chest. She was practically naked before him, caught off guard. In the most vulnerable position imaginable. The damp towel was the only barrier between her and his gaze, which slid over her shoulders, her bare collarbones, the wet strands of hair clinging to her neck. He didn't move. He simply watched, and in the stillness of the living room, his silence was louder than any scream. He drank in her image like a man dying of thirst in the desert. All the games, all the words, all the distance she had built up collapsed in an instant. There was no room for moves or rules here. There was only the transparent animal truth of his desire and her vulnerability. I didn't know you were here," she whispered, her voice shaking, betraying fear and embarrassment. He slowly placed the glass on the bar. The sound of glass hitting marble sounded like a gunshot. "I know," he replied quietly. His voice was low, hoarse with suppressed emotion. He took a step forward, then another. He wasn't approaching quickly, but each step stole the air from her. She retreated until her heels hit the edge of the sofa. There was nowhere else to retreat. "Ji-hoon." It wasn't a warning, but a plea. But even she didn't know whether she was begging to stop or to continue. He stopped a centimeter away from her, so close that she could smell his warmth, the scent of whiskey, and his own unique aroma, expensive soap, leather, and something elusive that was simply him. His eyes, black and bottomless, held her transfixed. "I'm tired of this game, Emily," he said. And there was no anger in his words, only exhaustion and that raw, unpolished honesty she'd been coveting from him. "I'm tired of counting the steps, tired of wondering what rule number 2, 3, or 4 is going to be." He raised his hand, and she closed her eyes, expecting a rough touch. But his fingers barely touched the damp ends of her hair, gliding down her cheek, barely grazing the skin. The touch was so gentle, so reverent, that tears welled up in her eyes. "You demanded honesty," he whispered, his lips so close to hers that she could feel them moving. "This is it. I want you. Not a servant, not a woman to be conquered. You, just like this, with wet hair, in a towel, without any protection, without games. His words disarmed her more than any kiss. He broke down all her defenses, not by assault, but by surrender. He admitted his weakness, and in that lay his strength. I'm scared, she breathed out, and it was the most honest thing she had said in a long time. Me too, he admitted, and his confession struck her the hardest. I'm afraid of scaring you. I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of this power you have over me. He leaned in, and this time she didn't pull away. She couldn't. His honesty bound her hand and foot more tightly than any physical force. His lips touched hers with such careful, such reverent tenderness that her whole body responded with a dull, aching shudder. It wasn't a kiss of capture. It was a kiss of question, a request, and she answered. Her lips trembled under his, and she answered his, I asked, with a silent but unconditional consent. Her hands, still clutching the towel, unclenched, and it fell softly to their feet, a silent cloud on the dark floor. He didn't rush. His kiss was slow, exploring, endlessly patient. His hands slid over her shoulders, down her back, pressing her against him, and she felt all the hardness of his muscles, all the power of his body, now subordinated to one purpose, to bring her pleasure. He touched her as if she were something fragile and priceless, and each touch made her skin burn and her mind empty of thoughts. He knelt before her, his lips sliding down her neck, her collarbone, her burning skin. She cried out, throwing her head back, and her fingers dug into his hair, no longer trying to push him away, but only trying to pull him closer, to lose herself in this sensation. All her carefully crafted plans, all her power, it all crumbled to dust under the onslaught of this all-consuming, primal passion he had held back for so long and had finally unleashed. He lifted her into his arms, light as a feather, and carried her to the sofa. His body covered hers, and there was nothing of a master demanding his own. It was the union of two lonely souls, two strong personalities, who had finally cast off their masks and allowed themselves to be simply man and woman. And when, losing her head with desire, she whispered his name, there was neither fear nor servility in her voice. It held that long-awaited, complete surrender that was her own voluntary victory.